Hello, hello, beautiful people. My name is Fox. I am the head of developer advocacy here at Meroxa, and welcome to Real Time with Meroxa. This is your show where we talk about data, what's going on, and everything in between. And today we had an episode prepared where we're going to talk about Conduit and Kafka. However, we had to do some reshuffling with guests, and today I bring to you a new guest, and you won't be disappointed. This is Rimas. Remus is our VP of product. Hello, Remus. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, Fox?
I'm doing super well. I would love if you can give the people, your quick elevator pitch.
I'm Rimas. I run product at Meroxa. I would say the thing I enjoy in my career is data. Add data to developer tools and throw a little bit of product management in there, and that's me.
That's a good summation. I like that. The I brought you here today on Real Time Araxa because you published a very interesting blog post yesterday. And I'm actually going to share my screen. There's just two blog posts I would love to tell you all about that recently went out. Remus recently published one called Conduit Now and Into the Future. And this one is what we're going to be talking about today. And there's also another one around how to deploy Conduit on Heroku with the Heroku one-click button. So a bunch of goodies for you to play around with, and I'm super excited to hear what you all think. Uh, so Remus, today, Conduit Now to the Future. Tell us about this blog post. What made you write this?
Um, well, the first thing was really about the product roadmap for Conduit itself. I think one of the things about roadmaps and why anyone should do them is that it gives folks a sense of where this product is going, the vision that the developers of the product have for it, and where they want to take it. Because if I'm a developer and I'm going to go look at open source software out there, I kind of want to know what this thing is going to do and what it's doing right now, number one, what it's going to do into the future. Because like I'm looking to solve problems, and if this product solves my problem right now, that's great. But if it continues to do so and it gives me a path to something bigger into the future, I kind of want to know that thing. That way I can go count on that solution to meet my needs.
Yeah, it's about long-term usage. That's how we build good systems. The so I would love to ask you for Conduit, what is that problem to be solved? What would you say, Conduit's goal is at its core?
Yeah, it's right there in the about section on the repo itself. It's about data integration amongst production data stores. Um, some of you might even be asking, well, what does that even mean? Like, why do I need production integration between why do I need data integration between my production data stores? I think you have to take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
As a developer, you're building an application, and that application may be, I don't know, a Next.js app or a Rails app. It might be backed by some kind of database. Maybe it's Postgres, maybe it's PlanetScale, maybe it's something else. And then typically, that's your app. Like it's pretty monolithic. It's great. You build it. It's fine. It works. All good.
Mm-hmm.
But as you start building on features, as you start layering on complexity to that application, as you start needing to do new things to serve the needs of your customers, typically your production environments start to add extra data stores. You could think of like search, right? You may be doing it in Postgres initially using full text search, but then you might find that you're outgrowing that. And what are you going to do next? You're going to add something like Elasticsearch, Algolia, something like that. All of a sudden now you've added another system to your infrastructure, which typically tends to be on the back end, tends to be some kind of data store in some way, shape, or form. And so the question becomes, well, like, how do I start moving data from one place to the next? You could start doing that via the application layer. Nothing's going to stop you from doing that. But sometimes there are issues in doing so, and sometimes that results in data inconsistencies, et cetera. And you actually need something that's going to move that data with some more guarantees than you would get via the app than what you would get via the application layer. And so that's kind of where Conduit comes in. Conduit's there to help you take that data from, let's say, your Postgres database, the transactional database that's powering your application, and then start moving that data somewhere else. And because the philosophy of Conduit is to focus on change data capture, meaning that every transaction that happens in your system captures those changes and sends that off, into like write ahead log or the bin log in MySQL, whatever it may be. You can capture those things and now start moving that somewhere else. So you got the record of the changes as they'd happened, and you can actually use that information to say, oh, I know what's changed. Let me go do something else with that downstream to power my other feature, for example. I brought up Elasticsearch and Algolia because that's a great example. If you have some table, let's say in your database that houses a bunch of information about, let's say, documents that maybe your app, as a writing tool or something, and it has tons of documents in it, and you store the info of those documents in your database, every change of those documents, will be triggered in the database itself, and just have Conduit shuffle it off right off to these search engines. It's super awesome. Like, you didn't have to put that complexity in your app. You moved it somewhere else, and you're solely focusing on the application itself.
And even the use cases that you're bringing up here are just like typical tasks that me as a software engineer, no matter what app that I'm building, like I think that's really what makes Conduit magical. Because the one question I have for you is that, Conduit, it ships with this awesome UI, and this allows me to easily go in, create a pipeline, uh, and start playing around with Conduit. But where do you see this being paired in the software development lifecycle? Like, where do you see this UI fitting, and how would I use this as I'm like building on top something on top of Conduit?
I could see this in a couple of places. Like, I think the question you're asking here is like, hey, Conduit ships with a UI. Why would I even use it in the first place, right? Well, I would think about this just a little bit differently. Like, there's varying degrees of usage and what you might consider a UI, right? A UI could be a front end, like you just showed us, where you go to a web page and you can interact with, buttons, widgets, and everything else. A UI can also mean an API, right? Which, in Conduit's case, you could totally interact with Conduit via an API if you so chose. Um, so let's take the example of just the like web interface, right? If I'm thinking of, hey, I want to start using Conduit for my, let's say search engine use case. Let's continue to use that throughout this conversation. If I want to test things out and I don't necessarily want to start using the API right off the bat, because you got to figure out all the parameters and everything else, the UI gives you a fantastic way of getting started on your local machine where you can boot up Conduit. You can go to localhost 8080 and say, okay, here it is. I'm going to start building some pipelines that move that data from one data store to the next. And you can set all that up really quickly via that UI and really just test this out. And the other thing I'll say, just generally though, is that because we've focused on the getting started experience with Conduit so much, literally it is just downloading Conduit and starting it. You'll get this interface right off the bat. So like the amount of time it takes to get to this is super minimal. So when I'm thinking about just getting started, I'll start here. When I'm thinking about, hey, maybe I want to orchestrate this, let's say, or put this in a production environment where I need to monitor a little bit more, or I want maybe my application layer to move data in different ways based on user input or something, maybe that's when I'll use that UI to go do that stuff. I don't know that I can hear you, Fox.
Always, always the hardware mute always gets me. Um, But I love that focus, and that really brings us to like the roadmap, right? So on the roadmap, I would love to start like let's pick off some of these things and let's have a discussion about why some of these items were important and why we prioritize these for O.2. Um,
Yeah.
and the first one I really wanted to start talking about was the connector SDK. 'Cause I think that's a really big one, and that's the one that I'm really excited about.
You just picked the meaty one right off the bat. I mean, I thought maybe we'd go from start to
Okay,
finish, top to
okay,
bottom or something, but no, no, it's okay. It's okay. It's fine. No, no, no. Let's start with the SDK, and then we can work our way around the next release.
okay.
Um, so the SDK, well, let's back up just a little bit. When we initially launched Conduit, there were a couple of connectors that we wrote that were very specific to Conduit initially. So that was a file connector, that was an S3 connector, and that was a Postgres connector. Between those three things, you're going to find a lot of usage and being able to um, use Conduit in those contexts, right? Oh, and also there's Kafka in there as well. Apologies. Um, but they were tightly coupled with the code base itself, which, if I am a third party developer or I'm someone that like wants to leverage Conduit, but I don't want to get into the internals or the deep bowels of whatever's going on in there, how do I actually write something so that I can connect whatever data store I use in my production systems to
Hmm.
get data moved through conduits. So the SDK was super critical because it allowed us to not only take those built-in plugins within Conduit and move them outside of the repository itself, but there's now this decoupling of being able to deliver features in Conduit and the robustness that comes with building these connectors. You could fix bugs, make new connectors, uh, do whatever you need to with your connector while Conduit can continue its own development, and you're not tightly coupled between the two. And that's really why the SDK came about. Because arguably we could have said, you know what, we could have built everything into Conduit, and you compile everything all at once, and you get everything as part of that whole package. That wasn't quite the right motivation for us to say, um, let's go down that path again, because we want folks to feel like they can develop what they want in the languages that they want. Granted, the first go at this SDK, um, you can write connectors in Go, but you can also write some others in other languages. It's just we're working on the documentation and making that just a little bit better right now. But again, the SDK is going to really allow you that power to develop whatever you need to.
Yeah, and really that decoupling is super important because when you think about getting started with the data pipeline tool, the first thing you think about is its connector support. But how does the tool get the awesome connector support is by making us like the connector building experience easy, simple, more streamlined, easier. Um, 100%.
You know what's dope about our SDK or Conduit's SDK is that I just wrote a connector myself last week. It literally there's only four methods that you have to code towards. You have to like be able to open some connections, read from your data store, ship that data off, and then close all connections. Like that's it. That's all you have to do. I wrote the thing in maybe a couple of hours, and this is where I joke where if the PM can do this, like anybody else can do it.
Yeah. I love that. Um, the so what's next? What else would you like to highlight from O.2?
Well, I'd like to talk about something a little bit more meta that comes across in the blog post that I want to mention here that I think is super relevant. So
Of
the
course.
one of the things further on down in this blog post is we talk about release cycles. I think release cycles are super important to understand when taking on any open source project and putting it into your production systems, because you have to think about reliability, you have to think about maintainability, and you have to think about ultimately that deprecation cycle, right?
Hmm.
Because software does not stand still, and because of that, you could end up in places where you're using unpatched versions, things go out of date, etc. And the Conduit team was very deliberate about, how do we want to do release cycles so that developers understood, when can you expect a thing? How much is going to go into that thing? And when are we going to say, hey, we're not supporting this thing anymore? So what you're looking at right now is an example of kind of a release cycle. Let's say the current state is, we're working on 0.6, and there are 3 supported versions beyond that, and then 0.2 is, being deprecated. Um, let's say 0.6 gets released, 0.7 becomes the one where we are starting to work on for the next set of features and things. 0.2 rolls off, like it's been sunset, it's no more. There's no more support for that. And 0.3 now becomes deprecated. Um, Conduit is going to operate on 6-month release cycles. It seems natural given the insight that we had done. We kind of looked at a bunch of other open source projects and kind of said, the range is anywhere from maybe 4 to a year, 4 months to about a year in which, any version is supported. And so we
Hmm.
kind of looked at it and said, okay, let's take these in 6-month cycles, and then we'll provide support, for about a year and a half, until we say, hey, it's going to roll off. So when you look at this roadmap, you kind of have to keep that in mind, that we're really trying to build towards that. But in the same token, one of the balancing acts is that you want to give developers that opportunity to kind of test things as they go along. And one of the features I'll point out on that roadmap board is that you have this ability now to go out and check out the nightly builds, which, for any new PRs and everything else that get merged, a nightly build will happen based on that new code, and you have that opportunity to go use that new feature. What's great about that from a developer's perspective, and even, I'll pull back the covers on kind of how we use Conduit internally at Meroxa, is that we use a lot of the nightly builds, and we use Conduit in our production systems. And so Meroxa is on the bleeding edge of testing Conduit, making sure it works, so that when you go to the main branch, you can be pretty confident that's going to work day in and day out. Yes, there may be some brokenness that might happen here and there, but we're going to be the ones to find that out way more quickly than everyone else. So you get that sense of production testing way earlier than you would with a lot of other products. So, those nightly builds are our way of, kind of giving developers that feature preview as new things get built.
And I mean, this is one of those things too, is that even though this is slated for 0.2, like you can go and play around with the nightly builds.
Well, that's the beauty of like having a roadmap in GitHub. I mean, from a product management perspective, from a developer perspective, like it's all here. I mean, if you're familiar with issues, you're familiar with PRs, you know that all the purple ones are the things that have been merged already or closed. You know that those things are going to make it into the 0.2 release. If you go into milestones in the repo itself, you'll see when that milestone is slated to be released. And because we're focused on timely releases, not necessarily putting features into those um, releases, we're always going to release on that cadence. Like it's always going to be 6 months and another one comes out. We'll never say, oh, we're not going to release a version because we have to wait for X feature. Like that's
Hmm.
something we'll never do. It's more about the systematic approach to development more so than anything else.
Hmm. Okay, I just caught my eye on another goodie here for you. What's that, Remus? The
Oh, you're looking at the Kafka Connect legacy connectors, right?
yeah.
Um, so, one of the patterns that when you go look at what developers do to move data between production systems is that they'll use Kafka and Kafka Connect to kind of make that happen. Where you need to go stand up a giant Kafka cluster, you need to go set up Kafka Connect, and then all of a sudden now you can kind of you put that data into Kafka as an intermediary, and now these other data stores can subscribe to that. I mean, it's a great pattern. It's something that has been transformative for the industry. What I think the challenge though is, and why we're taking a different approach to Conduit is that I think that initial getting started experience is really hard for a lot of those situations like we described at the onset of this talk, which is I'm starting out, I'm building an app, I might be a smaller team, I don't have the capability to go set up all of those bigger systems. How do I start doing this earlier in my you know infrastructure architecture kind of journey so that I can start moving this data without having to do all of that right off the bat. And that's really the genesis of Conduit itself, is that I am able to do that right off the bat with Conduit and not have to set up any other infrastructure. And Conduit can just move that data from one place to the next. There's nothing else that
Right.
you need to go set up to go do that. But we also recognize that for a lot of folks that are coming from that Kafka world, if they want to dip their toes into Conduit, they're going to have major investments in moving data into Kafka itself. They have all their connectors from what they do in Kafka Connect. We want to make it possible so that if they want to bring their connectors to Conduit and run them there, that's perfectly fine. We're not gonna run that stuff on behalf of anybody else. Like that's not our goal or anything else. The whole point is, look, you've made major investments. Keep your investments. Just put Conduit there under the hood, and you
Hmm.
can keep running those as is.
Just plug and play.
Absolutely. I think the benefit there for using Conduit is, look, it's all written in Go. You compile it down to a single binary and you just run that. Like, that's easy. Like, I'm
Yeah.
gonna keep using it all session long. Like, I can do that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I recently wrote a tool that I recently shared with you that's coming out later this week, that builds on top of Conduit, and actually it just calls on top of the binary and uses it directly. It's the easiest thing to start shipping with other bits of program, other systems. I think that's really the thing that I've been enjoying with it the most, is that, like, oh, I can just drop Conduit in there now.
Just put a little Conduit on it. I feel like we've got another like top 40
put,
song in there somewhere.
put some hot sauce, put some Conduit hot sauce on it. I love it. Um, is there anything else that excites you from the O.2 release?
um, yeah. When I'm looking at this, I think there's one other thing. When you go down and look at that OpenCDC architectural design review, I want to call that out because what we're trying to do is, yep, there's a lot of different formats that exist out there for change data capture.
Hmm.
It's the standard thing, like, hey, there's 15 standards out there, let's go create another one. Sure, like, we're going to go do this, it's going to be out there. But I think our goal with OpenCDC is to be much more deliberate about being able to take a format and give folks the expectation that between connectors and how you should expect the experience to be between those connectors, that's kind of where OpenCDC comes into play. It's not that we really want to create another standard or anything to that extent. It's more like we as stewards of Conduit want to say, look, you have all of these connectors. How should I expect that they work between any of them? And that's really developer experience right there. And that's what we're really trying to do with OpenCDC is, really be deliberate about that experience of how you get change data capture from any of these systems to then move to the next ones. Because as a developer, if I can't reason about what happens between every connector, that's just more friction you put into the process. Like, that's
Hmm.
now that developer then has to go in and look up, I don't know, connector X, Y, and Z and figure out what the hell that one does. Spend, I don't know, 2 months trying to work around that. The data ends up different in the downstream system. And then now you're trying to like do all these crazy transformations and everything else. That's just terrible. Why not reduce that friction up front? Kind of define some of these formats that then you can transform, not transform, transfer them to these
Yeah.
other data stores without having to worry about all that intermediate junk.
And what's and to even look at something like this, right? When I'm building a pipeline from Postgres to a file, or maybe even Postgres to Mongo, or um, Mongo to Redshift, and we talk about our Postgres to Elasticsearch. These different data stores they store the data on in many different ways, and like you mentioned, it's transform after transform after transform. Uh, if OpenCDC can be that intermediate, that hey, get anything into OpenCDC, and then now you can talk to all of these other things. It's it's really what the goal that we're inching towards. Because I think remember you and I had a really good conversation about this. There would never be this magical database that will solve all your needs. Our data infrastructure will just keep expanding and expanding and expanding because we're going to find, ooh, search. This is a really good use for this specific type of data store. Data warehousing, analytics, another specific type. Transactional, another specific type. And we're going to keep adding these systems, and all it's going to do is require something in the middle to be moving data in between one another.
Yeah, I mean, really to kind of bring it all together. That's really what all of these data movement tools profess to do. But honestly, a lot of data movement tools just do the work to get the data out for you, and then they YOLO themselves right out of there and say, you know what, it's up to you. I got you the data, like you're on your own. And then, you're dealing with all of these disparate formats and what happens, between the upstream systems because, the data movement tool chose not to help you out as developer to make it easier to reason about the data coming through to you. Yes, all of these upstream data stores are different. They have different operating modes, they have different operating characteristics, but the data itself that comes from these systems, you can do something with that and make it easier to reason about downstream so that you
Mm-hmm.
can, use those assumptions to build on top of to make, bigger and better things. This is where things like, um, this is things like the DevOps lifecycle, right? Like,
Right.
you know, Git showed up, it did its thing. It's not to say that it created and forced you into all of these things or just didn't stop you from doing anything, but because it had all of these places where you could reason about it, reason about the expectations of the things that came out of it, you can now build all of these tools around that to then make that whole process of the life cycle much more easier.
Mm-hmm. I love this conversation. I love this conversation. The so looking at our roadmap, and this makes me excited as a developer. Not only can we see like the next one, but kind of what's creeping into the O.3. And I would love to just make some time to call out one more. So is there anything here that from O.3 that you're like, that's definitely one we should talk about?
Oh, there's so much on there. I don't know. I don't know where to start.
I know I got to squeeze you into one.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I'm not going to pin it just to point three, but I'll talk about point three in the context of a larger path here. You'll see number 14 on the list there as transforms.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when it comes to real-time data, when it comes to CDC, when it comes to moving stuff to these other data stores, you're going to have to do something to that data before it ends up in the other data store. For example, customer data is a natural use case where sometimes the downstream system should not know certain things about certain bits of information upstream,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to do transforms to get rid of that sensitive information before it hits the downstream system is required. So being able to write those transformations is something that we're, you know, heavily invested in. And I think when you look at the longer term of that, what really excites me about those transforms is start thinking about something like WebAssembly and being able to like push that into the conversation with transforms and everything else, where you can now,
Mm-hmm.
write it in many different languages and then push this into Conduit itself to make that happen. That gets really exciting because now you've got these standard record formats that you can reason about. You've got code that you can easily write to transform this data before it ends up in the downstream system. Like it starts to become a game changer where now you can separate concerns as your infrastructure starts growing, and you can
Hmm.
start separating out from whatever your main application um, repository is, as a developer in your app, to say, okay, now my concerns for doing something else or with this data is this transform is going to do that now. Have put in a separate code repository, deploy, do all that stuff. It's gonna be awesome.
Yeah. This actually brings up, I think, a really good question for you. You know, I think a lot of software engineers solve a lot of data problems and don't particularly call them data problems. So if I'm a software engineer and I'm working on a problem, what should be those signals I should look for to, oh, this might be something to reach for and grab for Conduit with?
Um, it depends. That's the canonical product management answer. Like it always depends. Yeah, I think it depends on a couple of things. Like, your capabilities and as a development team and what you're looking to do, because I think start there, right? Because the last thing you want to do is introduce complexity into your application and your infrastructure, right? So if you've just got that single app with a data store behind it, I personally would sit there and say, do as much as you can to delay creating more complexity for as long as possible, because that complexity is going to slow you down, hands down. Like I
Mhm.
could probably go to every single engineering podcast right now, and every one of them is going to say the same thing in most regards. um, so when it's time to start reaching for that complexity, that tends to be around situations where that transactional data store is starting to do things that are a bit unnatural, where let's say you're starting to um, store every single event in your database itself, meaning like user events that start to happen. So you save that all off into the data store itself. That's when it starts to get a little, difficult. And now, the database is growing uncontrollably, or you're running into situations where you've got slow queries, or despite all of the query tuning you may have done, you need to start
Mhm.
looking at the shape of that data and saying, okay, what is happening here that is preventing me from continuing to build out my application? Yeah, generally, I'm just going to say, I think developers shouldn't have to worry about their data stores. Like they just shouldn't have to. Usually, when there's a problem, like it comes down to the data store, right? And so when you start running into those situations, you need to start making those assessments and saying, like, okay, is it the data store? Do we need to do something different? And like, do we need to introduce something like Conduit in there to offload some of the things that aren't natural for that data store itself into something else? Search always a great example, because you can get pretty far with Postgres and full text search, but
Mhm.
you're gonna reach a wall, and once you reach it, it's gonna be unpleasant, and you're gonna be a developer and you're gonna be pissed about your data store not living up to snuff when you're trying to build this application. Go put some conduit on it. Get whatever vectors you need out of the data store, and when those changes happen in the data store, offload it into conduit and have conduit push that into Elasticsearch.
Hmm. Are there, and this would be my last question for you. Are there any use cases now on the other end, right? So Conduit is kind of bringing these complex systems that we would typically have down to a binary, right? So now are there any use cases that you're like, oh, this wasn't possible before, or this would be really hard to do prior to just even having Conduit? Some of those larger use cases that now having this simple tool to move data back and forth, now we get something else that comes out of it. Are there any use cases like that you're interested in right now?
um I maybe I there's some trends in the data world that I'm kind of just still trying to wrap my head around, particularly this one around operational analytics.
Yeah.
There seems to be this trend where a lot of companies are trying to put their data warehouse in the hot path for production infrastructure, which I don't know. I take a step back from that. I get really concerned because if I was an SRE or anything else, and I'm looking at putting like Snowflake or any other system, this is not a dig on any one of those data warehousing companies. I'm their SLOs and everything else are great, but when you're thinking about like millisecond systems that serve customer needs on a front
Right.
end, to put the data warehouse in there seems like you might end up with a bad time because now you've introduced all of this latency, not just latency between moving data from the warehouse back into transactional systems, but like the latency of you know doing all of the analysis and everything else, and then having to ship that back. You find bugs or errors. It's going to be days before you can move all of that back. I would say maybe that's a use case on that side where you could say,
Right.
hey, move some stuff back to the transactional systems via Conduit. But I would be remiss in recommending that, hey, put the data warehouse there to put everything back in transactional systems when like I would much rather see somebody go and um, use the real-time data, maybe create some transforms or something else on that and process as it happens and put it back into the transactional system so that
Hmm.
that way you have fewer hops and fewer things to go wrong as part of being a production system that um, I think makes a bit more sense. And honestly, that's how most folks use Kafka today anyway, right? Kafka Connect and Kafka, which is you set up all that stuff, you move events through those systems, and you have those topics to then build applications that then do something with that data, right? And I think that's
Hmm.
where when you take an analysis of the industry overall, this is why I think everyone gets so excited about real-time data because no one's really cracked that nut yet around how do you use real-time data to be successful at providing like analytics back to customers or responding to customer needs in real time. Like it doesn't have to be just analytics. I think those are the use cases that are easy to grab for in the
Hmm.
industry right now, but there's so many other things to be done. I mean, fraud detection and anomaly detection tend to be like number two that comes up for a lot of folks. But there's so many other smaller use cases that it can exist in there that I think are still super valuable. Like take myself, I wrote that plugin, the connector last week. I wrote a connector that listens to a channel on Redis. I wrote a Rails app to like do some chat stuff. It uses those channels and active cable to pull that off. But now I actually could save every single chat message that happened using Conduit and dumping that into a file. Like that's awesome.
Hmm.
And then I could let folks in my app then download chat history. Like that's awesome.
That's it. And plug and play. I think that's the central theme of today. Sprinkle some Conduit on it. Um, so how can people get started with Conduit? Where would you like them to go?
Start with the repo, start with the README, go there, understand, kind of what we're trying to accomplish. If you're already at your terminal right now, um, go download Conduit right off the releases page here in GitHub. It's easy to get started. And like I said, once it's downloaded, open it, go for it. That's it. Like, and you're ready to go.
Just run Conduit. Just type the word. Sprinkle some Conduit on it. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Remus. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you all for watching. Hopefully, you learned a lot about the Conduit roadmap, where we're going, where we're headed, and let us know if we're taking this project down the right way. We would love to hear from you. I think that's the one thing that we talk a lot about with Remus and I is we want to hear from you. So let us know if we're building is the right thing. Let us know what you think about it, and we will be happy to answer all of your questions. So we really appreciate your time, love, and attention. Until next time, have a beautiful day, you all.